In November 2023, a man known for rarely giving interviews and avoiding the spotlight stepped into a Seattle courtroom. Wearing a simple navy suit with no tie, Changpeng Zhao, better known as CZ, stood before a federal judge and pleaded guilty to violating U.S. anti-money laundering laws. The founder and former CEO of Binance, the world's largest cryptocurrency exchange, now faced a criminal conviction that could carry prison time. This was not a rumor. It wasn't speculation. It was real. The crypto world didn't just shake, it fractured. Just a year earlier, Zhao had been hailed as a survivor. In the ashes of FTX's dramatic collapse, while other CEOs were dragged into disgrace or bankruptcy, CZ stood seemingly untouchable. Binance was bigger than ever. Investors still clung to his every word, and many believed that Zhao, with his minimalist persona and monk-like control, would lead the next phase of the crypto revolution. But within the shadows, the walls had already begun to crack. What no one could see behind his calm exterior was that the U.S. Department of Justice had been building a case for years. The accusations were severe. Binance had allegedly turned a blind eye to billions of dollars in suspicious transactions. Some were linked to sanctioned countries, others to criminal enterprises, and all of it happened under CZ's watch. When Zhao entered his guilty plea, he didn't try to shift the blame. He accepted responsibility. The courtroom was silent, but the headlines were deafening. A man once worth over $65 billion was now barred from leaving the United States, awaiting sentencing, and handing over control of his empire. It was more than just a legal fall. It was the symbolic collapse of crypto's most enigmatic king, a man who had convinced millions that financial freedom didn't need regulation, now brought down by the very laws he tried to outmaneuver. How did it come to this? How did the soft-spoken engineer from China, who built a trillion-dollar platform from nothing, end up facing years in prison? To answer that, we have to go back to where it all began. Long before the headlines and courtroom, before the billion-dollar valuations and crypto summits, Changpeng Zhao was just another immigrant kid trying to make ends meet. Born in Jiangsu, China in 1977, CZ moved with his family to Vancouver, Canada, when he was a teenager. His father, once a university professor in China, had been labeled a pro-bourgeois intellect during the Cultural Revolution, an early lesson for Zhao on the volatility of systems and the fragility of authority. In Vancouver, the family scraped by. Zhao worked part-time flipping burgers at McDonald's and pumping gas to help support them. It was a humble start, far from the glamorous image the world would later associate with him. But he was driven by something deeper, an engineer's mind paired with a gambler's risk tolerance. After studying computer science at McGill University, he began working on trading systems for the Tokyo Stock Exchange and then at Bloomberg's trade book. By the time Bitcoin entered his orbit in 2013, Zhao already understood the financial world better than most. A friend introduced him to the idea of decentralized currency, and it hit him like lightning. He sold his apartment shortly after and went all in. This wasn't a side project. For CZ, it was a revolution. He began working at various crypto-related firms before founding Binance in 2017. His idea was radical but elegantly simple. Create a global crypto exchange with low fees, fast transactions, and no centralized headquarters. Within just 8 months, Binance had become the world's largest crypto exchange by trading volume. The rise was meteoric. Investors were flooding in, drawn to Zhao's vision of frictionless finance. At its peak, Binance handled more than $70 billion in daily trading volume. Zhao's image became mythological in the crypto space. He wasn't flashy,
He didn't flaunt wealth. He wore a black hoodie and seemed allergic to traditional corporate vanity. In a world full of tech bros and hype merchants, CZ's monk-like presence felt refreshing. Media painted him as the anti-CEO, calculated, minimal, fiercely intelligent. Binance grew beyond just being an exchange. It became an empire. Zhao launched his own blockchain, issued Binance Coin, BNB, and built an ecosystem of tools that made Binance nearly unavoidable for anyone in crypto. While governments and regulators were still trying to define what cryptocurrency even was, CZ was building an infrastructure that moved faster than any of them could catch. He didn't just ride the wave, he was the wave. By 2021, Changpeng Zhao had become one of the richest men on the planet, with an estimated net worth surpassing $96 billion, and yet he still refused to name a company headquarters. In interviews, he'd laugh off questions about where Binance was based. He'd say, "We're decentralized. Bitcoin doesn't have a headquarters. Why should we?" It wasn't just a clever line. It was his entire philosophy. But what CZ didn't realize, or perhaps refused to admit, was that building something too big, too fast, and too untouchable doesn't protect you from the fall. It invites it.
To the outside world, Changpeng Zhao was the monk of modern finance, a man of restraint, strategy, and serene control. But behind the minimalism was something far more complex, a leader obsessed with autonomy, a company built on opacity, and a power structure that thrived precisely because no one could quite pin it down. Unlike most tech CEOs, CZ didn't live in Silicon Valley mansions or grace the pages of glossy business magazines with his lifestyle. His wealth was mythologized, but rarely flaunted. There were no yachts, no Ferraris, no red carpet appearances. But what CZ craved wasn't luxury, it was control. At Binance, he had it all. He was the founder, the face, and the final decision-maker. Binance had no board of directors in the traditional sense. There were executives, but none could override Zhao. The company had no single headquarters, making it nearly impossible for any regulatory body to establish jurisdiction. It operated globally, but was based nowhere, or everywhere. This decentralized setup wasn't just philosophical, it was strategic. It allowed Binance to offer services in countries where regulations were unclear or non-existent. It allowed the company to bend, blur, or completely avoid the rules that traditional financial institutions had to follow, and it all flowed through one man. Internally, employees were compartmentalized. Few had the full picture. Many didn't even know where their colleagues were based. Decision-making was centralized entirely around Zhao. When investigators later reviewed Binance's operations, they would describe it as a black box. Even some senior staff were allegedly unaware of where customer funds were held or how transactions were routed across Binance's vast interlinked infrastructure. And then there were the whispers. Reports began surfacing about Binance allegedly allowing users to trade anonymously, skirting know your customer requirements. Journalists tried to track the exchange's movements and kept hitting dead ends. Offices would open and close without notice. Leadership positions would change or vanish. CZ rarely appeared in public, and when he did, his answers were cryptic. It was as if he enjoyed being untraceable. Critics accused him of building a shadow bank for the unregulated corners of finance, and yet millions trusted him. Retail investors praised his no-nonsense communication style. Crypto influencers idolized him. Even when regulators in countries like the UK, Japan, and Germany began cracking down on Binance's operations, CZ simply tweeted his classic one-word response: FUD. Fear, uncertainty, doubt. To his supporters, it was a sign of confidence. To regulators, it was a red flag waving from the top of a very tall empire. Beneath the calm persona, Zhao maintained a ruthless edge. Those who disagreed with his methods quietly left. Partnerships that questioned Binance's legal frameworks were abruptly ended.
and journalists who dug too deep found themselves stonewalled. And while Zhao never raised his voice in public, insiders say he ruled with an iron grip behind closed doors. His belief was unwavering that crypto should remain untethered, unregulated, and unrestricted. That freedom mattered more than compliance. But freedom, when scaled globally, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a system. And like any system, if left unchecked, it can rot from the inside out.
It started with a trickle. Quiet investigations, murmurs in regulatory circles, rumors on crypto forums. But by the end of 2022, the trickle became a storm. And by 2023, it was a flood. The U.S. Department of Justice, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network had all been watching Binance. Quietly, methodically, they'd been building a case. The exchange's opaque structure, its lack of KYC enforcement, and the massive flows of untracked funds had raised red flags across multiple jurisdictions. Then came the leaks. A trove of internal Binance communications, obtained by journalists and investigators, painted a damning picture. Executives had allegedly acknowledged internally that users could bypass location restrictions and KYC processes. One message in particular hit headlines, an executive warning that Binance was becoming a haven for dirty money and criminal funds. Another email suggested the company was fully aware of sanctioned users operating freely on the platform, including individuals from Iran and North Korea. But the most damaging claim? That Binance and CZ himself had allegedly facilitated over $10 billion worth of transactions in violation of U.S. laws. These included money linked to terrorist organizations, sanctioned countries, and illicit drug networks. And while other platforms had implemented robust compliance teams, Binance had allegedly deliberately underfunded and sidelined such efforts. In March 2023, the CFTC filed a civil lawsuit against Binance and CZ, accusing them of willfully evading U.S. law. It was the first domino. Others fell quickly. The SEC launched its own investigation. European regulators followed. Banks began severing ties. Binance lost access to key payment rails. Former employees came forward with damning testimonies. Journalists uncovered additional links between Binance and sketchy offshore entities. Internally, the company was unraveling. Senior executives began to resign. Tension between legal teams and CZ mounted. Trust eroded. Employees who once saw Binance as a crypto utopia now described a culture of paranoia and concealment. And then, in November 2023, the unthinkable happened. CZ appeared in a U.S. federal courtroom and pled guilty to violating the Bank Secrecy Act by failing to implement an effective anti-money laundering program at Binance. The plea wasn't part of a long trial. It was swift, clean, calculated. As part of the deal, Binance agreed to pay the record $4.3 billion fine, one of the largest corporate settlements in U.S. history. CZ personally agreed to pay a $50 million penalty and step down as CEO, effective immediately. The man who had once boasted that Binance didn't need to follow the rules of old finance had just admitted to breaking some of its most foundational laws. Regulators declared victory. U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland called it a message to the entire crypto industry: play by the rules or pay the price. Treasury Secretary Yellen noted that Binance had enabled a vast network of criminal actors to thrive unchecked. But for Zhao, the most painful blow wasn't the fine. It was the silence. His once loyal followers online splintered into factions. Some defended him, citing regulatory overreach. Others felt betrayed. Many simply disappeared. The empire hadn't just been fined, it had lost its soul. What followed were a few cryptic posts from CZ, short, ambiguous, and rare. A new chapter, he tweeted the day he resigned. But even those words couldn't mask the enormity of what had been lost. An unregulated dream, a decentralized ideal, a trillion-dollar vision. All brought down not by a market crash or a hack, but by the one force CZ thought he could outmaneuver:
accountability.
When the courtroom lights dimmed and the headlines began to fade, what remained was the slow, suffocating weight of consequence. Changpeng Zhao was no longer the CEO of Binance. He was no longer the most powerful man in crypto. He was, instead, a convicted criminal in the eyes of the United States government, awaiting sentencing, stripped of his title, barred from returning to the life he had built. As part of his plea deal, CZ agreed to remain within U.S. borders until his sentencing, scheduled for late 2025. He surrendered his passports. He was required to seek permission before traveling, even between states. It was, effectively, a form of gilded exile. The man who once lived out of a suitcase, hopping from Dubai to Singapore to Malta, now found himself grounded, geographically and symbolically. His silence was deafening. There were no grand media apologies, no YouTube confessionals, no public reckoning. He posted rarely, and when he did, it was clinical, almost algorithmic. "Building," he tweeted once. Another post simply read, "Learning." Gone were the days of memes and snarky FUD responses. In their place was the quiet hum of a man staring into the wreckage of his own empire. Binance, too, was different. The company appointed a new CEO, Richard Teng, a longtime compliance executive. The message was clear. Binance was entering a new, sanitized phase, one that aimed to appease regulators and shed the reputation it had earned under Zhao's reign. But not everyone bought the transformation. Trading volumes on Binance dropped sharply in the months following the scandal. Investors pulled billions. Competitors gained ground. For years, Binance had operated like an untouchable fortress. Now it felt more like a fortress under siege, patched together, vulnerable, exposed. And for Zhao, the future hung in limbo. He faced up to 18 months in prison, though his legal team pushed for leniency, citing his cooperation and willingness to take responsibility. Still, the stain on his record was indelible. He had gone from crypto's messiah to its cautionary tale, and in the echo chamber of digital finance, where memory is short but gossip eternal, that transformation was brutal. Supporters pointed to his legacy. Binance had helped millions access crypto, created jobs, pioneered infrastructure. But critics countered with the obvious. He broke the law, endangered financial systems, and profited massively while doing it. What couldn't be debated, however, was the scale of the fall. Once worth nearly $100 billion, CZ had joined the ranks of a very different elite, tech moguls who flew too close to the sun and paid the price in isolation, disgrace, or imprisonment. As the sentencing date loomed, one question persisted. Was this truly the end of CZ, or just an intermission before his next reinvention?
In the wake of scandal, it's easy to flatten a man into a villain. It's easy to point to the courtroom photo, the billion-dollar fines, the headlines screaming criminal, and call it justice. But the truth, like everything CZ ever built, is more complicated than that, and perhaps more uncomfortable. Changpeng Zhao didn't just break the rules. He rewrote the game while pretending the rules didn't matter. But what if he wasn't trying to be above the law? What if he genuinely believed the law had no place in the world he was building? For years, CZ preached a gospel of decentralization, autonomy, and borderless finance. He wasn't selling tokens. He was selling freedom. To millions of users in unstable economies, Binance wasn't just a platform, it was a way out, a tool of escape, a symbol of resistance against slow banks, corrupt governments, and outdated systems. And yet, in chasing that vision, he made compromises, dangerous ones. He allowed the same lack of oversight that made crypto feel liberating to also make it vulnerable to criminals, to abusers, to nations evading sanctions. He opened the gates and left them unattended, believing that technology would self-regulate. It didn't. He built a behemoth too fast, too loose, and too resistant to accountability. But ask yourself, is Zhao a singular outlier, Or is he the inevitable product of a system that celebrates growth at all costs, punishes hesitation, and rewards those who move fast and break things? He didn't hide what he believed. He was transparent in his philosophy, opaque in his operations. He wasn't the most corrupt man in crypto. He might have been the most honest about his intentions. That's what makes his downfall so haunting. Because it wasn't greed that brought CZ down. It was conviction. Misguided, flawed, and perhaps fatally naive, but conviction nonetheless. He believed in a world without centralized power. And in the end, it was centralized power that reminded him who's still in charge. Today, CZ lives in silence, awaiting sentencing. The empire he built now tries to survive without him. And the crypto world, once full of revolutionaries, is learning that every revolution eventually meets a courtroom. The final image is not of a man in chains. It's of a man in stillness. No tweets, no headlines, just a former king watching the world he tried to set free slowly close back in on itself.